concerned about what you read, even though it was just social media. So I fear we won't see this like anytime. This is such a challenge. In his instructions for the youth, he asked the family and all of those speaking not to be negative about the country, to speak only positive. And they all did that. The contrast was obvious. You know, the people on Twitter was crazy. Remember at the end of the service in the National Speaker, they all got up and together read the Apostles' Creed, which is that Christian prayer, and they didn't read it. It's like they didn't. They just didn't. Everybody, all the presidents and vice presidents, everybody was reading, and they got pictures of it. And so the Twitterverse, as we call it, is crazy with criticizing even supporters.
Welcome to the Center for a New American Security. I am Victoria Newland, the CEO here. We are so delighted to have in the House Senator Mark Warner to discuss a new U.S. doctrine for cyber warfare and information operations following Russia's interference in our 2016 elections. And in the threat, should I start again, Jess? All right, we're going to start this thing again. Apologies for our technical difficulties. Welcome everybody to the Center for a New American Security. You know, our Russian friends are at this again, right? Maybe our Chinese friends.
Here you go.
Are we good? You want to do this one? You want to bring me a new one? All right. You know, I think this is a pretty good sort of symbol of what's going on around here. Next time I'll learn to sing, I'll learn to dance. Yeah, exactly. All right. 3. All right, we're going to test it before I do my song and dance again. Are we ready? Yes? Is that a yes? As long as the
What
person
I
has
do
my-
to make a program go forward.
Exactly. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Center for a New American Security. I am Victoria Newland, the CEO here. We are delighted today to have in the House Senator Mark Warner to discuss a new U.S. doctrine for cyber warfare and information operations in the wake of Russia's interference in our 2016 elections and in the face of growing threats to our democracy and security from multiple areas in these domains. A few words first about our guest. Senator Warner had a very successful career in technology and in business before he went on to serve as Virginia's governor from 2002 to 2006, my home state. He was elected to the Senate in 2008, and he's now in his second term. He is on Senate Finance, Banking, and Budget and the Rules Committees, but he is probably best known these days for being vice chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The SISI, as you know, has been conducting a wide-ranging investigation into Russian election interference and the implications for our democracy and our security, and it's been releasing regular reports that have been very impactful. I've had the honor and privilege of being a regular guest of the committee, and I want to take this opportunity to commend the leadership of Vice Chairman Warner and Chairman Burr and their colleagues on the committee for their thoroughness, for the bipartisan spirit with which they've conducted their work, and for their unwavering commitment to protect America. I want to thank you. These issues are also front and center for the Center on New American Security here. In 2019, we intend to launch a major project on countering high-tech illiberalism, focusing on all the ways that autocratic regimes are using technology to challenge free, open societies and to corrode democracy from the inside, and addressing, we hope, many of the issues that Senator Warner will raise today. We will partner with industry, academia, and the policy community to develop strategies to sharpen America's strategic edge and that of our allies to deter and defeat these threats. After our remarks, we have some time. The Senator will take a few questions, and then after the Senator has to depart, I hope some of you will stay around. We're going to have our CNES experts comment on the speech and give their views on where we go next. So with that, we are delighted to have Senator Warner with us.
about being a little bit late. I can unambiguously say that when I was governor, there was a lot less traffic. Great. Are we on? All right. Great, guys. Normally I wing these, but I got a lot to say this morning. And, I want to thank, first of all, the Center for New American Security, Victoria, who we had a chance to get to know and respect, and appreciate your leadership here. Mr. Fontaine, great to see you, and Eli Ratner was involved in putting this event together as well. And this really is, I share with what Victoria said, I think one of the most urgent challenges of our time. The use of cyber warfare by our adversaries and the need for us in the United States to articulate a clear and thoughtful U.S. cyber doctrine. Now, a little unusual that we're doing this today on December 7th, which is obviously an auspicious date in our history. We remember Pearl Harbor as the first foreign attack on U.S. soil in modern history. Unfortunately, we also remember Pearl Harbor as a major intelligence failure. As Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I've spent the better part of the last 2 years on an investigation connected to America's most recent intelligence failure, which was also a failure of imagination, a failure to identify Russia's broader strategy to interfere in our elections. Our federal government and institutions were caught flat-footed in 2016, and our social media companies failed to anticipate how their platforms could be manipulated and misused by Russian operatives. Frankly, we should have seen it coming. Over the last 2 decades, adversary nations, like Russia, have developed a radically different conception of information security, one that spans cyber warfare and information operations. I fear that we've entered a new era of nation-state conflict, one in which a nation projects strength less through traditional military hardware and more through cyber and information warfare. For the better part of 2 decades, this was a domain where we thought in the United States we had unparalleled superiority. The thinking was our cyber capabilities were unmatched. Our supposed superiority allowed us to write the rules. This confidence appears to have blinded us on 3 important developments. First, we are under attack, and candidly, we have been under attack for many years. Our adversaries and their proxies are carrying out cyber attacks at every level of our society. We've seen state-sponsored or sanctioned attacks on our healthcare systems, energy infrastructure, and our financial system. We are witnessing constant intrusions into our federal networks. We are seeing regular attempts to access parts of our critical infrastructure and hold them ransom. Last year, we saw global ransomware attacks increase by 93%. Denial of service attacks increased by 91%. According to some estimates, cyber attacks and cybercrime account for up to $175 billion in economic and intellectual property loss in North America alone. Globally, the estimates are closer to $600 billion. And typically, our adversaries aren't even using their most sophisticated cyber tools. They are attacking opportunistically, using phishing techniques, and figuratively rattling unlocked doors. This has all been happening under our noses. The effects have been devastating, yet the attackers have faced few, if any, consequences. Second, in many ways, we brought this on ourselves. We live in a society that is becoming more and more dependent on products and networks that are under constant attack. Yet the level of security we accept in commercial technology products is unacceptably low, particularly when it comes to the growing Internet of Things. The problem is only compounded by our society-wide failure to promote appropriate cyber hygiene. It's an outrage that more digital services, from email to online banking, don't come up with default two-factor authentication. And it's totally unacceptable that large enterprises, including federal agencies, aren't using the available tools of defense. Lastly, we have failed to recognize that our adversaries are working from a totally different playbook. Countries like Russia are increasingly merging traditional cyber attacks with information operations. This emerging brand of hybrid cyber warfare exploits our greatest strengths, our openness and free flow of ideas. And unfortunately, we're just now waking up to that fact. Looking back, the signs have been pretty obvious. 20 years ago, Sergei Lavrov, then serving as Russia's UN ambassador, advanced a draft resolution at the United Nations dealing with cyber and, quote, prohibiting particular dangerous forms of information operations. Now, we can debate the sincerity of Russia's draft resolution, but in hindsight, the premise of this resolution is striking. Specifically, the Russians saw traditional cyber warfare and cyber espionage interlinked with information operations. It's true that as recently as 2016, in the Russia operations against our system there, the cyber operations, the hacking of the DNC and the Podesta emails, was carried out with one vector, and the misinformation and IRA activities were on a separate tracks. But there's no doubt that Putin and his leaderships now sees the full potential of marrying these cyber operations. By contrast, our country spent 2 decades treating information operations and traditional information security as distinct domains. And increasingly, we treated info operations as quaint and frankly outmoded. Just a year after Lavrov introduced the resolution, the United States eliminated the United States Information Agency, relegating counter-propaganda and information operations to a lower tier of foreign policy. In the 2 decades that followed, the U.S. embraced the Internet resolution as inherently democratizing. But we ignored the warning signs outside the bubble of Western democracies. The naivete of U.S. policymakers extended not just to Russia, but to China as well. Recall when President Clinton warned China that attempts to police the Internet would be, quote, like nailing Jell-O to the wall. In fact, China instead has been wildly successful at harnessing the economic benefits of the Internet in the absence of political freedom. China's doctrine of cyber sovereignty is the idea that a state has the absolute right to control information within its border. This takes the form of censorship, disinformation, and social control. It also takes the form of traditional computer network exploitation. And China has developed a powerful cyber and information affairs bureaucracy with broad authority to enforce their doctrine. We see indications of the Chinese approach in their successful efforts to recruit Western companies to their information control efforts. It's pretty amazing to me that Google is actually looking to work with China to develop a censored version of its search engine in China. Today, China's cyber and censorship infrastructure is the envy of authoritarian regimes around the world. China is now exploiting both its technology and its cyber sovereignty doctrine to countries like Venezuela, Ethiopia, and Pakistan. With the export of these tools and ideas, and with countries like North Korea and Iran copying Russia's disinformation playbook, these challenges will only get worse. And yet, as a nation, we basically remain complacent. Now, despite a flurry of strategy documents from the White House and DoD, the federal government is still not sufficiently organized or resourced to tackle this hybrid threat. We have no White House cyber czar, no cyber bureau, or senior cyber coordinator at the State Department. And we still have insufficient capacity at both state and DHS when it comes to both cybersecurity and disinformation. Our Global Engagement Center at the State Department is not sufficiently equipped to counter propaganda from our adversaries. And the White House has still not clarified the roles and responsibilities for cyber across the whole expanse of USG. While some in the private sector have begun to grapple with these challenges, many more remain resistant to changes and regulations needed. And the American people are still not fully aware and cognizant of the threat. And they've not internalized the lessons of the last few years. We have a long way to go on cyber hygiene and online media consumption habits. Let me be clear, Congress as well does not have its act together. We have no cyber committee. Cyber cuts across numerous committee jurisdictions, frequently hindering our ability to get ahead of the problem. And it's even worse in the area of misinformation and disinformation. And the dangers are only growing as new technologies such as deepfakes, where audio and video manipulation can literally put words in the mouth of an elected official, a business leader, or any other leader. And these efforts are now being commercialized. The truth is, we all know as a nation, we are becoming ever more dependent on software. But at the same time, we are treating cybersecurity, network resiliency, and data reliability as afterthoughts. And these vulnerabilities will only continue to grow as our so-called real economy becomes increasingly inseparable from our digital economy. If we're going to turn this around, we need not just a whole of government approach, but we need a whole of society cyber doctrine. So what would a US cyber doctrine look like? It's not enough to simply improve the security of our infrastructure, computer systems, and data. We must also deal with adversaries who are using American technologies to exploit our freedom, our openness, and basically attack our most important asset, our democracy. So let me modestly lay out 5 recommendations. First, we need to develop new rules and norms for the use of cyber and information operations. And we need to better enforce existing norms. And most importantly, we cannot do this alone. We need to do this on an international scale. We need to develop shared strategies with our allies that will strengthen these norms. And when possible, we need to get our adversaries to buy into these norms as well. The truth is, our adversaries continue to believe that there won't be consequences for their actions. Now, we all know in the post-9/11 national security environment, we spent tremendous energy combating terrorism and rogue states, and that was appropriate. But frankly, we've allowed some of our near-peer adversaries to operate with relative immunity when they attack the United States in the digital domain. There have been some reports in the press about the United States supposedly pushing back at second-tier adversaries on occasion. And some of these items we all know. But we've virtually avoided this with Russia and China out of a fear of a cyber escalation. I think we all would recognize if through cyber tools somehow Moscow got shut down for 24 hours, it would be a problem. But if someone shut down New York for 24 hours, it would be a global crisis. And as a result, for China and Russia, it's pretty much been open season in terms of their attacks against the United States. This has to come to a conclusion. We need a national conversation about defensive and offensive tools we are willing to use to respond to the ongoing threats we face. In short, we need to start holding our adversaries accountable. failing to articulate a clear set of expectations about when and where we will respond to cyber attacks is not just bad policy, it's downright dangerous. We are allowing other nations to write the playbook on cyber norms. Part of this is a result of U.S. inaction. From the late 90s into the early 2000s, the U.S. was a consistent dissenting voice at the UN where meetings on cyber norms were proposed. In part, this reflected our aversion to piecemeal approaches to cybersecurity. But it also reflected a view that we didn't want, as America, to be bound by lesser nations. In 2015, there was a major effort at the UN, including the United States in this case, to agree to principles of state behavior in cyberspace. We saw some international consensus around protecting critical infrastructure and investigating and mitigating cybercrime. Unfortunately, these 2015 principles at the UN failed to address economic espionage. And even the short-lived 2015 US-China cyber espionage deal was insufficient. And in 2017, disagreements between the US, China, and Russia led to a deadlock on the question of how international law should apply to cyber conflicts. And let's acknowledge, since that time, little progress has been made. Now, it's been true that some folks in the private sector and the NGO space have stepped up. Look at Microsoft's Digital Geneva Convention. Look at the recent Paris call for trust and cybersecurity, trust and security in cyberspace that was signed by 57 nations, but not the United States. This is another example of the United States stepping back on the world stage and allowing countries like France to fill the void. Recently, the US government and the State Department in particular have renewed efforts to advance norms and norms discussion. The efforts must be elevated and strengthened. But norms on traditional cyber attacks alone are not enough. We also need to bring information operations into the debate. This includes building support for rules that address the Internet's potential for censorship and repression. We need to present alternatives that explicitly embrace a free and open Internet. And we need that responsibility to extend not only to government, but to the private sector as well. We need multilateral agreements with key allies, just like we've done with international treaties on biological and chemical weapons. That discussion needs to address mutual defense commitments. We should be linking consensus principles of state behavior in cyberspace explicitly with deterrence and enforcement doctrines. U.S. policymakers with allies should predetermine responses for potential targets, perpetrators, and severity of attack. That means clearly and publicly linking actions and countermeasures to specific provocations. That could mean sanctions, export controls, or indictments. It could even include military action or other responses. Now, we should be realistic, though, about the limits of norms in shaping behavior. Let's not kid ourselves. At least in the short run, nations like Russia that routinely ignore global norms is not going to make an about-face in the cyber domain. But this should not deter us. It should give us simply a more realistic set of expectations for how quickly we can expect to see results. But the stronger we make the alliances, the more teeth we can apply to these norms, the more countries we can recruit to them, the more effective the efforts will be at disciplining the behaviors of Russia, China, and other similar adversaries. My second recommendation is we need a society-wide effort to combat misinformation and disinformation, particularly on social media. My eyes were opened to this through the Intel Committee's investigation on the Russian incursion. Everyone on the committee, Democrat and Republican alike, agrees that the linkage between cyber threats and disinformation is a serious challenge, especially on social media. And again, in some ways, this misuse and abuse of social media was a whole new world for the Intel community. It's now clear that foreign agents used American-made social media to spread misinformation and hijack our civil discourse. Again, let's quickly recap. The Russian playbook in 2016 included cyber penetrations of our election infrastructure, hacks and weaponizing of leaked information, amplification of divisive pro-Kremlin messages via social media, traditional overt propaganda, funding and supporting extreme candidates or parties, and misinformation, disinformation, and the real thing in terms of fake news. The goal was and is to undermine our faith in facts, our faith in the news media, and our faith in the democratic process. The truth is, none of this ended in 2016. This is an ongoing threat, and not just to the United States. We've also seen these tools used against all Western democracies. We've seen them used to incite racial and ethnic violence in countries like Myanmar. This threat is particularly serious in countries with low media literacy. In many ways, in those countries, social media is the internet. So what do? How do we combat this threat? We can start by recognizing that this is truly a global problem. A 21st century cyber and misinformation doctrine should lean more into our alliances, like NATO and other allies who share our values. Earlier this year, Senator Rubio and I brought together a group of 12 parliamentarians from across our NATO allies, and every one of our NATO countries have indicated they have seen evidence of Russian intervention within either their election process or within their civil society. We got these 12 parliamentarians together at the Atlantic Council. We've focused this meeting on combating Russian election interference. Now, the irony of the meeting date was that was the very same day that President Trump appeared on the international stage with President Putin, and we saw an American president kowtowing to a Russian leader. Meanwhile, we were working with our NATO allies to develop a roadmap for increased cooperation and information sharing to counter Russian cyber and misinformation, disinformation aggression. In many countries, the truth is, because they've experienced this for a longer period of time, these countries are further along in educating their populations about the threat of misinformation and disinformation. Last month, I met with the Prime Minister of Finland. As he put it, the Finns have been dealing with Russian disinformation and misinformation for well over 100 years. But Finland is one of the most resilient countries when it comes to countering this threat from its neighbor to the east. I asked why. Again, I believe it's partially because of their whole of society approach. It relies on a free press that maintains trust through strong self-regulatory mechanisms and high journalistic standards. It places a limit on the use of social media platforms, particularly for the very young. They also have a vibrant digital civics initiative, something that we desperately lack. Finland's approach also depends on a national leadership that stays true to its values, even in the midst of contested elections and its own brand of partisan politics. Here in the United States, it will take all of us, the private sector, the government, including us in Congress, as well as the American people, to deal with this new and evolving threat. In terms of the private sector, the major platform companies like Twitter and Facebook, but also Reddit, YouTube, Tumblr, aren't doing nearly enough to prevent their platforms from becoming petri dishes for Russian disinformation and propaganda. I don't have an interest, let me be clear, in regulating these companies into oblivion or stopping innovation. But as these companies have grown from dorm room startups to huge media companies of the 21st century, they have to acknowledge with that great power comes greater responsibility. I recall very vividly that immediately following the 2016 election, when I started to raise the question that we might have had Russian interference, Mr. Zuckerberg publicly ridiculed the idea that Russia had influenced the US elections via a Facebook post that he basically said the idea that Russia intervened was, quote, a pretty crazy idea. Now, I don't pretend to have all the solutions, but I expect these platforms to work with Congress so that together we can take steps to protect the integrity of our elections and civil discourse in the future. Now, companies like Facebook and Twitter have taken some helpful voluntary steps, but we need to see much more from them and their peers. That's going to require investments in people and technology to help identify misinformation before it spreads widely. Now, I put forward a white paper with 20 ideas that lays out some of the policy proposals for addressing this. For example, I think we can all agree we need to start with greater transparency. I think that human beings ought to have a right to know when they're being contacted on social media, whether that message is actually coming from a fellow human being or from a bot. There's nothing inherently wrong with machine-generated information coming to us, but we ought to have that knowledge. I've also put forward bipartisan legislation, the so-called Honest Ads Act, that would require greater transparency and disclosure for online political advertising. I also believe we need a full-fledged debate on the fact that companies should have a duty to identify and ferret out inauthentic accounts. If someone says they're Mark posting from Alexandria, but it's actually Boris from St. Petersburg, we at least ought to have a geo-indicator when that post appears. We've also put forward some detailed ideas around how we look at platforms' responsibility, and I would acknowledge that Facebook acknowledged this responsibility to try to take down truly defamatory content. I think platforms also should give greater access to independent academics and other analysts studying social trends like disinformation. In our paper, we also put forward a number of other ideas around privacy, price transparency, data portability, just the basic idea that if any American knew how much data was being collected, that would help increase our knowledge. The truth is, most Americans think these services are free. There is nothing free about the amount of information these companies collect about each of us and then use in the marketplace. Now, these ideas are intended to spark a discussion, and we desperately need social media companies' input. But we have to move quickly, and at some point, if they don't work with us, Congress will have to act on its own. One thing is clear: the wild, wild west days of social media are coming to an end. Third, we need to harden the security of our computer networks, weapon systems, and IoT devices. Many of the responsibilities for cyber and misinformation and disinformation will fall on the government. But our nation's strategic response must also include greater vigilance by the private sector, which, to tell the truth, has frequently resisted efforts to improve the security of their products. For over a decade, the United States thought it could set a light touch standard for global data protection by basically avoiding legislation. And while, let me be the first, as a former business guy, I understand regulations can have costs. But what we've also learned in our country is that inaction can also cause costs, as other jurisdictions leap ahead of us with more stringent privacy and data protections. We see this with the GDPR, where the US's failure to adopt national reasonable data protection and privacy rules left the field open for candidly clunkier European rules. And these standards that were set by Europe are now being adopted by major economies like Brazil, India, and Kenya. More broadly, we need to think about a software liability regime that drives the market towards more secure development across the entire product lifecycle. But nowhere is the need for private responsibility greater than in the Internet of Things. General Ashley, director of the DIA, has described insecure IoT and mobile devices as, quote, the most emerging cyber threat to our national security. So, as a first step, we should use the purchasing power of the federal government to require that IoT devices meet at least minimum security standards. And again, I have bipartisan legislation on this with Senator Corey Gardner. At least at the federal level, with federal dollars, we need to make sure that the devices we purchase are patchable, need to make sure that they don't have hard-coded passwords that cannot be changed, and we must make sure they meet standards that they're free of known security vulnerabilities. On a broader level, beyond IoT, public companies should have at least one board member who understands and can model cyber risk. Another area I've been working on is trying to impose at least some level of financial penalties on companies like Equifax, who fail repeatedly to take the necessary steps to secure their systems from cyber intrusions. Unfortunately, even in areas where we could expect a higher level of security and cyber hygiene, we find some of these same problems. In October, a GAO report found that, quote, nearly all of our new weapon systems under development are vulnerable to cyber attack. Now, earlier this year, we successfully included language in the NDAA requiring cyber vulnerability assessments for weapon systems, which hopefully will help correct this problem. And the Pentagon has recently taken steps to make cybersecurity a greater priority within the DoD. But frankly, we face serious workforce challenges as well in recruiting and retaining top cyber professionals in the government when they have such attractive offers in the private sector. Now, this is a good segue to my fourth recommendation, realigning some of our defense spending priorities. The United States military budget, and I'm proud to say I'm as pro-defense as anyone, recently was passed at $716 billion. The remarkable thing is, when we look at Russia, its budget, military-wise, is about $70 billion. The truth is, the United States is spending most of its money on conventional weapons and personnel. By contrast, Russia devotes a much greater portion of that much smaller budget to cyber and other tools of asymmetric warfare like misinformation. Russia has come to the realization, and some of this goes back to 2011, when the then chairman of the Russian equivalent of chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff laid out the Russian military doctrine for the 21st century, where they said Russia could not compete with the West in terms of tanks and trucks and ships and guns, but in the realm of cyber or misinformation or disinformation, they could compete. And the truth is, when it comes to cyber, misinformation, and disinformation, Russia is already our peer, and in the areas of misinformation and disinformation, I believe is ahead of us. Truth is, if you look back at Russia's effectiveness and cost effectiveness, if you add up all that Russia spent interfering in our elections in 2016, all they spent in the French elections in 2017, and then add on their cost of spending in the Brexit election, and then add it all together, it's less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. So the notion that this is a one-off example isn't the case. This is both an effective methodology for Russia, and it's also remarkably cheap. The same is true with China. China spends more on its defense budget, and some of that's opaque. But estimates are that it spends around $200 billion. Again, spending a disproportionate amount on cyber and misinformation and disinformation. And the frightening thing to me is the delta between what we spend on our defense budget and China spends, that $500 billion, China is investing in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G technology, and a whole host of other technologies in the 21st century technologies where China hopes not to simply be our peer, but to actually lead the world. Frankly, they're starting to outpace us in these investments by an orders of magnitude. We need to realign our priorities while we still can. We need to redirect some of our DoD spending towards cyber and, frankly, within other parts of our government, misinformation and disinformation. And at the same time, we need that Sputnik moment to make sure that we make the investments in 5G, AI, quantum, and other technologies to keep a pace of particularly China. The final point is that we desperately need strong federal and presidential leadership for any U.S. digital doctrine to be truly effective. Because this challenge literally touches every aspect of our society, we need presidential leadership and a senior coordinating official to head the interagency process on this issue. It's true there are men and women within DoD and DHS, and within other agencies, working really hard to try to protect the United States from cyber attacks. And we made some good progress in 2018 in terms of election security. But only the president can mobilize the whole of society strategy we need. Now, I do want to acknowledge some positive steps, even by this administration, have been taken in recent months. The White House and DoD have released 2 important strategic documents on cyber strategy that move us in the right direction. I also welcome the delegation of authorities to defend and deter cyber attacks below the presidential level. This will allow for quicker responses and greater interagency coordination. But again, these actions alone are inadequate. In the most recent NDAA, Congress attempted to establish a more aggressive posture on U.S. cybersecurity policy. This includes the potential use of offensive cyber capabilities to deter and respond to cyber attacks against U.S. interests, as well as authorization to combat info operations. It also grants the President and Defense Secretary authority to direct Cyber Command to respond and deter, to quote, an active and systematic and ongoing campaign attacks carried out by countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. These powers, if used correctly, are important components of a cyber doctrine, but by definition, they require decisive and thoughtful leadership at the top. I'll leave you with a couple of final thoughts. Obviously, more broadly, we need a coherent strategy for how to deal with the hybrid approach of cyber and disinformation that is coming from our adversaries. But let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I am not advocating that the U.S. mimic the approach of Russia and China, the idea that states have a sovereign right to control or censor information within their borders. Frankly, that is a vision that's incompatible with American values and our Constitution. What I am saying, though, is that we need to confront the fact that our adversaries have an approach that considers control of information an essential component of their overall domestic as well as offensive, defensive, and offensive strategies. We have not only failed to recognize this situation over the last 2 decades, but we've particularly tended to downplay and minimize the dangers of information operations. The truth is, the 2016 presidential campaign served as a wake-up call for cyber attacks and information operations. Now, people keep warning, and today being December 7th, of a digital Pearl Harbor or a digital 9/11, as if there will be a single act that will wake the country and make us take action on these issues. But I think I know, and I think many of you in this room know as well, we're already living those events on a daily basis. Simply look at the 2017 NotPetya attack. In the United States, we treated that as a one-day news story that was way below the fold. The truth is, the cost of that one single attack was more than $10 billion. This is the most costly and devastating cybersecurity attack in modern history, but most Americans have no idea that it even occurred. The true cost of our cyber vulnerabilities and the true cost of those attacks won't come with a single event. They will be gradual and accumulating. Our personal, corporate, and government data is being bled from every network every day. Our faith in our institutions and our tolerance for one another is being eroded by misinformation. This is leaving us exposed as individuals and vulnerable as a country. It's time that we dramatically shift how we view these threats. I hope the ideas that I've laid out today will help move us towards the comprehensive cyber doctrine and disinformation doctrine that we so desperately need in these challenging times. Thank you very much. Did I lose half of that when I dropped my mic on the...
Well, thank you, Senator, for that enormously rich
and fulsome approach to these issues, and for outlining a real strategic doctrine for these things. There were some controversial things in
What you had to say there.
I'm going to start with one aspect, which is the use of offensive operations in the cyber realm. You yourself pointed out that on the one hand, our adversaries have not paid much of a price, but on the other hand, turning out the lights in Moscow might mean the lights get turned out in New York with far more catastrophic consequences. Talk a little bit more about a judicious and appropriate use of offensive cyber, including what lessons we can draw from old-style deterrence in terms of the signaling you can do before you get to the level of having to use these weapons.
Well, let's back up for a moment and say why I feel like we've been reluctant to use these capabilities. Let's face it, our nation is more technologically advanced, particularly over the last 30 to 40 years. Some of that technological advantage vis-a-vis China is being more and more equalized. So consequently, I think it was understandable that policymakers were afraid of cyber escalation because the amount of devices, connections, networks that could be brought down if we entered into the cyber domain was much tougher on our end of the agenda than potentially our adversaries. And so consequently, I think our adversaries have thought they could steal with impunity. Think about the OPM hack, and that we had extraordinarily high levels of attribution before we would respond. If we had a consensus around cyber norms, and we had agreement on an international basis that you don't turn off somebody's water system or electric grid, I think that we could then put on notice that our adversaries could expect at least in-kind or similar type offensive capabilities from us. Now, defining that in a way so that it's not, the analogy is often made to nuclear, where, mutually assured destruction is not where I'm necessarily headed, but I think our adversaries have known that we've not been willing to use these tools, and we've always felt like we could only respond in alternative domains, has made us more vulnerable. So you almost need the international agreement on norms before you can start using the offensive capabilities, because you need that general agreement that say, if you go into these certain actions, then we will use potentially offensive. And that offensive can be on various gradations. It doesn't have to be tit for tat, but we clearly have some of the tools to penetrate our adversaries' networks just as they do with us.
A little bit complicated though, even as we want to work with allies, we don't want to give up our own sovereignty to some collective hope of a normative regime, right?
But it also begs the question of, do you extend, and this is where I think, I don't have a position, but I think it needs to be thought, do you extend these shared defense commitments the way we have in the traditional military domain into the cyber?
Right. One more from me, then we'll go to the audience. You were pretty clear that this is only going to work, the kind of doctrine you call for, with a whole of society approach, and particularly with strong presidential leadership. We know where we are now, that some aspects, whereas the administration, as you outlined, has taken some strong steps and put out some strong documents and done some retaliatory work, the president himself is somewhat ambivalent in what's fake news and what's not fake news.
That's a gratuitous, or that is a generous description.
I'm a recovering diplomat. What would you like to see in terms of leadership from the president and his cabinet on these issues obviously outlined? But if we're going to have the kind of cyber hygiene as a nation and as an alliance and public education campaign that you call for, what would you like to see from the White House now?
Well, first of all, I think it would start with an acknowledgement from this White House that the Russian attack in 2016 was comprehensive, that it weaponized information, that it manipulated social media, that it touched our at least 21 of our state's electoral systems, and his still refusal to fully acknowledge that, I think, really disrupts and undermines some of the very good people in his administration who are trying to fight this back. No one in the Trump administration in the intel or defense world doesn't acknowledge what happened in 2016. But the fact that the head of our government still it's hard to get those words out of his mouth is a real problem and a real challenge to many Americans about the seriousness of this threat, number one. Number two, the fact that this White House eliminated the senior person on cybersecurity sent absolutely the opposite message to both government and to society at large. Number three, in a normal administration, in a normal world, after we had a foreign nation attack our basic election system the way the Russians did, in a normal administration, because of the bifurcated nature of our election system, federal, state, local, the only entity that could really bring about increased election security would be presidential or White House leadership, at least in convening the bodies. That didn't happen. There's some good folks at DHS that have tried, so the responsibilities actually fall into Congress. But we have Senator Langford and Senator Klobuchar has got very good legislation, broadly bipartisan, that would ensure that if states, wouldn't force states, but would ensure that if states wanted to get federal dollars around election, you got to have a paper trail. You got to be willing to audit the elections after the fact. That the three companies that have control 90% of all the voter files and some of the equipment manufacturing ought to at least have some independent ability to analyze to make sure they don't have malware. Now, that would normally be done by a White House, but again, you have a president that refuses to acknowledge this problem, and it makes it much, much tougher to get to the results we need.
Questions from the audience? Please wait for the microphone to come around to you and tell us who you are before you ask your question. Woman here in the red.
Hi, thank you for having this event, Senator. Maggie Miller with Inside Cybersecurity. You were just mentioning the Secure Elections Act. Oh, is this not on?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. You were just mentioning the Secure Elections Act, which I know has been unable to go through Congress, this particular Congress. What have you heard from leadership on pushing this through next year, and do you think this could happen in the next few months?
We will renew our efforts. I don't make political predictions that often, but I bet if this bill got to the floor, it would get at least 80 votes in the Senate. And with the Democrats taking control of the House, it will clearly pass the House. The objection has come from the White House. And, we simply, what I would hate to have is some other event where we see foreign, doesn't have to be Russian because the playbook is now out for other countries to use as well, where we see an intervention to then force us to act. This is responsible, light touch, and quite honestly, the vast majority of election officials, even from some of the most conservative states who are reluctant to have any kind of federal intervention, the vast majority have now recognized the problem and I think would welcome the help and welcome the assistance. There's really, in the election system, there's the voter file, there's the voting machines, and then the computation process. We've made particularly, I think, progress at the voting machine level, but even there, this is all voluntary. So DHS has got its Albert system monitoring. But if the local registrar said, no, I don't want the DHS system, I want to hire my brother-in-law, who's got a little IT shop, they can still do that. We'll not prohibit that, but we would make the federal funds, Secure Election Acts would make the federal funds contingent on some kind of basic good hygiene standards.
Jim Miller.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Thanks for being here today. I'm Jim Miller. I'm on the Board of Advisors for CNES, proud to be. I'm Undersecretary of Defense and interested in these issues. and a constituent. I want to ask two quick questions. One is a clarification. You noted that the United States should not engage in the same restriction of information as Russia or China. I wanted to ask you to confirm that when you talk about us turning up the dial for misinformation and disinformation, you're talking about our countering of that activity, not to turn the dial up for the United States. I'm confident that's what you believe. I want to make sure that's just on the record.
Absolutely. This is about having the capability both on a DoD and IC side to counter malicious efforts, whether by Russia, China, or other foreign actors in their interference in America. And quite honestly, to be able to at least collaborate with our allies as well and learn from our allies, where I mentioned Finland, same situation in Sweden, where they had elections and their civic literacy, digital literacy, I think there are lessons we can learn.
Thank you. And then the question is, you talked about the need for strategic guidance and coordination at the national level at the White House. You were active in creating broadening of authorities for the Department of Defense so that a broader range would be considered traditional military activities, which I think is very valuable. Would you comment on what you believe would be the next step? And do we need an operational capability, a day-to-day national command and control element for cyber along the lines of what someone in DoD would call a joint interagency task force?
Short answer is, I'm not sure. I think we are still, as we still go through the discussions since I've been in Congress, do you split NSA and Cyber Command? How do you separate the two? The line between the two operations is blurred. I mean, the notion that everything either falls into a defense or offense capability is a really fuzzy line here. So I think this is something we need. We need your expertise. We need others' expertise to kind of sort through. I think the takeaway on potentially in terms of potential use of offense as well as the message we need to send. There has to be clarity, and I think you start with the international norms that says if you country do X, and we violate, and it falls into a category where it violates an agreed upon international norm, I would argue there might be then lower standards of attribution for us to respond. The willingness to at least take out or disable some of those operators. That doesn't mean you actually have to respond in kind in terms of turning off the power system, but it does mean you might be more aggressive in disabling some of their cyber operations. And it obviously should leave the whole field of other options to the White House and DoD to do. I do think the idea, and this is where I commend the Trump administration, where they've at least moved some of this decision-making from simply at the presidential level down at least to the DoD level. I think that's smart.
We have time for one more. Okay, great. Gentleman here in the blue jacket. Right here. Right here. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Sean Lingus with Cyberscoop. I wanted to talk a little bit about the post-2018 election security environment. We learned this week that the NRCC had a breach to email accounts with officials within the party that took place much earlier this year. We're only learning about it now. I'm wondering, A, if that should have been made public sooner out of transparency, or if by contrast, making that public so some sort of undermined confidence somehow in the process, how you feel about that. And then more generally, given that that was a revelation that came out this week, should we have an after-action public disclosure report from the administration on the election security measures, what worked and what didn't?
Let me take those in reverse order. My committee, the leadership will be receiving that after-action brief. My hope would be after we've received it, to see as much as possible if we could share it with the balance of Congress and where possible share it with public, number one. Number two, in terms of I think you raised a good question on the NRCC breach, but it begs two things. One, it begs the continued failure in 2018 to have any data breach notification standards, or the fact that we've got 49 different laws and there's no standard. So whether it's NRCC or whether it's Marriott or the host of other breaches that take place, the fact that there is no standard notification, I think is a hole and a flaw. And I think in many ways what the Russians, and we've seen this not only NRCC, but we saw it with the attempted penetration of Senator McCaskill. The Russians get, or the bad guys get better as we get better. So we may be tightening and strengthening our election security, but one of the most vulnerable places are the major political committees, but even more vulnerable than the committees are campaigns. The ultimate startup is a political campaign, and the notion that cybersecurity is going to be on the top 3 when your goal is getting reelected or electing someone isn't going to take place. And I know I think we can, for the most part, celebrate at least what we know now in terms of our success in 2018. What I see in 2020, the kind of the worst case scenario, is this merger between cyber misinformation, disinformation. And the example I'd cite is when you have a foreign entity that would hack a repository of personal information, an Equifax, where then the foreign entity has your mother's maiden name, your social security number, and contacts you with information that you think must be secure because it's got all this personal information, and you open up and you don't get a post that says it's from Victoria Nuland. What you get is her image and words coming out of her mouth with deep fake technology that takes the next iteration of misinformation combined with sophisticated cyber. You talk about the ability to wreak havoc, and it probably won't even play out. It may play out in a political circumstance, but just the effect it could have on the markets. If everybody popped up on Wall Street and got a message from Jay Powell talking about changing interest rates that was not Jay Powell, you'd have chaos in the markets, and we are not fully prepared for that. Let me take one last question.
Third time's the charm.
I'm right here.
Third time's the charm, Senator.
All right.
I'm right here. Right here.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I wonder if you could say a word about systemic attacks. You were saying there wouldn't be a single attack, but how do you prepare for attacks on electricity grids, attacks on Wall Street, attacks on systems that combine public and private? If you can't even protect new weapon systems that are vulnerable to attack, how do you even prepare for a potential systemic attack that could shut a country down?
Great question. Well, you start with the low-hanging fruit. My fear, and the power grid, the electric systems in our country, they have done a better job than virtually any other. They in the financial sector have done a great job. My concern is they put all of these sophisticated systems in place about the actual power generation, but the surface vulnerability dramatically increases when in the cafeteria, in the control room, the microwave is now IoT connected, and the ability to get in through that device. And we've seen examples like this of whether it's plumbing systems or other systems, and the fact that we don't have minimum security standards on IoT devices. We're at about 12 billion devices now purchased that are not secure for the most part. We're going to purchase another 20 billion in the next 10 years. It's insanity. And frankly, that some of the industry they're doing this just because they don't want to spend that extra few cents, and we're literally only talking a few cents about putting in de minimis security. So we start with the vulnerability. Second, I want to reiterate this point. We have been waiting for the catastrophic cyber Pearl Harbor or cyber 9/11. If you take away nothing else from my speech today, take away the point that we are living this on a slow bleed basis every day. And to a degree, it is the responsibility of both industry and government to be more forthcoming about these breaks. This is where the idea of having within the corporate structure people who have better understanding of cyber. It means as well, I think, the intelligence community needs to be more willing to declassify some of the type and nature of the attack so that people are on more alert. So that we're not going to stop everything and have 100% success, but we can gear up our day-to-day defenses rather than waiting for that single catastrophic event. And one of the areas that I've been looking at is that let's take the 3 areas where we probably had the best protections: the power grid, finance, and telecom. But one of the things I've started convening meetings between those industries, because even if you protect your specific network, if they take down your bank, if they take down your power grid, you got to communicate with the grid, with the financial sector, and if at the seams we don't have interoperability protection, we're really in a challenge part. And this is again where, while I am not aware of the particulars about the arrest of the Huawei official in Canada, and I want to see the evidence and concerns about. I do have concerns about the idea that business leaders across the world may be suddenly at risk and you get into a tit for tat in that arena. I am very concerned about the lack of recognition that as we move into 5G, we've never had a time in my lifetime when around technology standards they've not been set by Western, either by America or by Western entities. But with the increasing ability of China to both sell its technology cheap and invest in many countries, many of these standard setting are done by international bodies where volume overcomes size of your particular economy. And this is a real threat in terms of companies like Huawei and CTE. And while I applauded the administration, particularly when it took on CTE, it was pretty discouraging that it only took one pushback from President Xi before the administration crumbled.
Senator, what a rich discussion we've had today. We want to thank you for being with us. I want to ask the audience to stay with us for our follow-on panel of CNAS experts. But first, join me in thanking Senator Warner for being with us.
The director of our technology program, Paul Share, and Carrie Cordero, our Robert Gates senior fellow. So if you guys want to come up, we'll I can just do the handheld mic here. We can pass it down. Paul, let me start with you again. Paul's the Share, the director of our technology program, the author of a terrific book, Army of None, which is probably sold out. Maybe they ordered more on Amazon, but pick it up if you haven't yet for Christmas and the holidays. Paul, you've obviously been thinking about these issues for a long time. What stood out from you in this speech?
Yeah, I think So I think that the thing that jumps out at me was Senator Warner's comment that we have 20th century institutions trying to grapple with 21st century threats. And we don't have the right institutions in place. You pointed out we're spending $700 billion on defense next year. And we're building things that are, short-range fighter aircraft and ground troops and aircraft carriers. things that are not suited for these challenges that we're facing. We were in a great place. We had to refight the Persian Gulf War. We would win it 3 times over. But now we're in a situation where adversaries have learned, they've adapted, they are going where we are weak. And so now Russia doesn't have to fight us in a military way. They can use disinformation, and they're attacking the central nervous system of American democracy by manipulating our online discussions, by sowing distrust, right, among the American populace. And I think whether, how successful they were in 2016 or in the most recent midterms, that's one conversation to have. But we shouldn't wait until we see, oh, wow, they have been successful in an election to respond. We need to do that now. And we need to bring both tech companies and the government together to do that. You've seen a lot of energy in the private sector. The social media companies have been doing things to crack down on this. And then there's a lot of energy on the Hill. There was a lot of legislation, Senator Warner mentioned some of it, that's being kicked around. We also see activity at the state level. California recently passed a law requiring bot disclosure. So, we need to bring these communities together to come up with solutions that make sense.
And just quickly, what do you make of this issue of regulating social media?
Look, we regulate cars, we regulate airplanes, we regulate food, we regulate drugs, we regulate medical devices. Devices that are, things that are hazardous, where there might be externalities, there might be information asymmetries, and you're going to have harm, we regulate those things. So I think we're at the point where some of this digital technology, we're going to have to talk about smart, sensible regulation.
Great. And Carrie, I know you've looked at these issues in the Justice Department, inside the intelligence community, as a legal scholar. What did you hear today?
I thought one of the headlines was really what he said at the outset, which was that he quite forcefully acknowledged that the events of the Russian interference in the 2016 election was an intelligence failure. We really haven't seen current government officials categorize it in that way. Some former intelligence officials, some outside writers or observers have categorized it that way, but we really haven't heard current government officials, whether in Congress or in the executive branch, who have access to intelligence, who have been involved in some way. Obviously, the senator has been very deeply involved in the review of what happened in 2016, describe it as an intelligence failure. And I think it's important that he did it. I think it's right that he did it, and I think it has consequences both within the intelligence community to figure out why that happened and whether that pertains to intelligence priorities or recalibrating intelligence priorities, or whether it resulted because there is still some seam in between foreign intelligence collection and the fact that these activities in 2016 and are continuing, by the way. It wasn't just limited to 2016. They are continuing 2018 and going forward. Whether it was because the activities were directed domestically and that was not picked up in sufficient time. But I think that was an important point. To follow up on what Paul was describing in terms of, and what you asked about the social media companies. So this has been a consistent theme of the senators throughout the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into the 2016 election and Russian interference, which has been that he has been continually displeased with the response, reaction, and next steps that the technology industry and the social media companies in particular are taking. And here we are 2 years into it, and he is continuing to, while recognizing some improvements and some voluntary activities that the companies are taking, he is still clearly unsatisfied with what they're doing. And he said quite clearly that if the companies are not going to step up further in terms of assisting Americans with understanding the disinformation efforts that are being directed at them in their communities and in their homes and on their devices, that Congress is going to step up and do something about it.
And just follow up, what role do you see for Congress, not just with the social media companies, but in terms of an oversight role? I know you've thought a lot about this. What role should his committee in particular, but Congress in general, be playing beyond just the social media question?
Well, I think he identified them in some ways. So one has to do with the issue that he was discussing with Victoria Nuland, which has to do with offensive capabilities. He mentioned the National Defense Authorization Act, and there was a provision in the 19 Act that did specifically authorize Cyber Command to take certain specific, appropriate, proportional activities against certain nation states like Russia that are engaging in activities that would affect our democracy. So more things like that. Specific authorizations that the committees that Congress can put into legislation that make clear both Congress's push to the administration to take direct action and also then has clarity in the law about what they can do is one. A second thing I would suggest would be on this issue of not so much a look back at what happened in 2016, but going forward, the Intel committees certainly have an important role to play to make sure that the intelligence community is setting priorities and doing collection and doing strategic analysis in a way that is calibrated towards current and future threats and so I think there's a real meaningful role for the Intel committees to play there.
Great, and Richard Fontaine, what jumped out to you here today?
There were a few things that jumped out. First, Senator Warner stressed deepfakes as a emerging technology that can be, quite problematic for the reasons that he described, and he mentioned in the Q&A a couple of other things he sort of put together. And I think that's only the sort of front edge of what we're going to be dealing with coming down the pike here. I mean, you can imagine automated bots at scale and advances in natural language processing and other AI-powered applications, and things that we, as we sit here today, probably can't yet envision that may emerge even in a relatively short period of time. All of which sort of amplify, I think, the call to arms and that he delivered here today. The second thing that was interesting to me was on the China aspect of this. I mean, the assumption for many years had been that China couldn't sort of keep ideas off from changing its own society. That the internet was going to change China rather than China changing the internet. And I think we're seeing that's certainly the limits of that assumption. China is pretty successfully being able to segment the internet for starters, and then we're seeing increasingly companies, governments, people bending the way that they act on the internet to China's desires rather than seeing China's desires moderate or change over time because of the free flow of information. That then gets into this remark he made about the 2015 cyber espionage agreement between the Obama administration and China, and by press accounts, that's basically, it worked for a while in significantly reducing the amount of corporate espionage and IP theft, but then this is sort of tailed off, and as the Trump administration has put its emphasis elsewhere. And first, I was actually a bit surprised to learn in the aftermath of that it actually seemed to work to some degree, because I was pretty skeptical. But that it did work and that it is no longer working, I think, is emblematic of the fact that the administration has a very different set of priorities when it comes to China. The president is focused on the trade deficit first and foremost, and then other aspects of economic interchange. But if you sort of step back and ask, what do we really care about the most? It would seem to me that this is a much higher priority than, say, the trade deficit. And Eli Ratner knows more about China than I ever will, but the Chinese will listen to priority number one. They'll listen a little bit less at priority number two. Once you get to 3 or 4, they're not even listening anymore. And so we have to make some choices about that. And then I guess finally, I liked a lot his emphasis on addressing these threats in an alliance framework. If you think about it, if Russia came with tank columns into a NATO country, we would know what to do. We'd all get together, and there's a plan. If Australia was somehow attacked, we would know in the context of the ANZUS treaty what to do. But when Australia's democracy has been disrupted to some degree by Chinese cyber activity, that was just an Australian thing. There's intelligence sharing, but the response and what to do about it was considered really a domestic matter. When France had its own cyber compromises by the Russians, that was a French matter. It wasn't a NATO matter, it was a French matter. And yet, what is more threatening to our own way of life, our own societies, our own national security, than the disruption of the core thing that makes us distinctive, which is our democratic political process? And so I think this has to be dealt with. I totally agree with him. This has to be dealt with in an alliance framework.
Not only an alliance framework, but the notion of an extended deterrence commitment.
Well,
in
yeah,
an alliance framework.
exactly.
Very interesting idea. Did want to open it up to questions here. If you want to identify yourself and.
Sure, Bottom Ryan from Defense and Aerospace Report. Great speech on Senator Warner's part and a great discussion here. So the question would be a declaratory policy, right? I mean, so Richard, for example, what does a NATO-wide structure look like? What do boundaries look like? And do declaratory strategies on this work, right? I mean, that's been a big and long debate about whether or not, you know, in nuclear, for example, there's a little bit of ambiguity, but actually quite a lot less ambiguity than people would think. What are the importance of declaratory strategies, and would any strategy you create as an alliance actually be sufficient, right? I mean, what would be the level of that policy to sufficiently deter a Russia that frankly has gotten away with just about everything it's wanted to get away with, including vast chunks of Ukraine, and you know, that's not going to change either.
I mean, I'll try to take on the declaratory policy. I think you can think about this kind of at two levels. One is at the level of the Jim Miller level, I would call it, because Jim and I have written a couple of.
That's a very good level.
That's a high level. A couple of
Literally and figuratively,
exactly.
it's a high level.
A couple of reports about how to think of new technologies in the context of strategic stability, and I do think it's possible to think about a declaratory policy with the potential cyber effects on strategic stability, nuclear weapons, for example, nuclear command and control. I think you could actually have a fairly clear declaratory policy. Once you're getting into, you know, all of the other kinds of things, I think it's pretty damn hard to, you know, define very precisely what's in and what's out. But that's where I think Senator Warner was onto something. You have to have specific responses to specific activities, and you have to threaten specific responses to specific activities. So yes, you could have an overall kind of, you know, try to come up with some sort of declaratory policy, but let's start with saying you know, in 2016, the benefits to Russia, what it did, were very high and the costs were very low. Let's start by upending that, by attacking specific responses to specific things that they do or others, and I think that would take us, you know, a significant way forward from where we are.
And we have a case study in that because the example of the 2015 cyber agreement with China, which is probably the best example we have of some effectiveness, even though it was for a short time, came about because the Obama administration threatened very specific sanctions against Chinese entities for their cyber espionage. And that's when they sent a very large delegation from Beijing to Washington and hammered this thing out in a way that we hadn't made progress in a long time. So that was, I think, a case in point. This can work if you're specific and you're serious and you're credible. Next question.
John Gray, question, maybe one to use. Question refers to old DoD infrastructure. How is that being hardened? Let's start with those aircraft carriers. Let's start with those F-22s, which aren't all that old. Let's start with that tank. How is that being hardened if this has now become not only seams between the private and public sector, but what do you do with this existing thing? How hardened is it if you can't protect an F-35?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge concern, obviously. And Senator Warner talked about this recent GAO report highlighting cyber vulnerabilities across the force. I mean, one of the places we've imported computer technology across DoD, and it's made the department much more effective. But we have, at the same time, imported all of these vulnerabilities that come with computers and networks. That existed in other industries as well. DoD is not alone here. But we've got to put cybersecurity, you know, right at the top of the agenda. It's good that Congress and DoD are working together to make sure that this is now, you know, a major priority in defense programs. And you know, we've got to think smart as we're using some of these systems about ways where there are, you know, analog and offline backups, where there are ways to fall back on older methods of communicating or functioning. You know, it wasn't that long ago where we all lived in a world where we didn't have the internet, right? And things were fine. We had landline telephones, and we had pen and paper, and like things got done at maybe a little bit slower pace. The DoD in particular has to focus on resilience because they need to be able to operate in a world where we should expect to face massive cyber attacks. in the types of operations that they're going to have to deal with. And so they need to think about that and not be dependent, use these technologies that are available, but not be totally dependent on them, because that dependency alone creates an incentive for people to attack.
Great. Yep. Just wait for the mic. Hi, Patrick Barry, a couple different affiliations, but today I'm representing New America Foundation and their cyber program. So I really enjoyed Senator Warner's comments, including his specific, but probably rare praise of this administration for delegating authority to the Department of Defense for taking a limited amount of cyber operations. And obviously there's been a tremendous work in Congress to further clarify authorities, particularly with respect to some of the adversaries that we face. But one question I'd like to hear some reactions to is, what do you do when the threats which are manifesting in cyberspace are manifesting across an internet which is global in nature, but is also viewed by certain countries as being their sovereign territory? These countries that are major adversaries in cyberspace have a practice of co-opting infrastructure in what some people call gray space, which other countries call their own sovereign networks. How do you operate freely, deter effectively, counter adversary activity when the adversary is operating kind of the global commons? Any thoughts on how we can actually get an implementation of that? Thanks. Sure.
Well, I think it certainly highlights, and your question highlights one of the major challenges that people in government are dealing with right now, which is the gray space that you described between where our Department of Defense and Cybercom can act. And it also highlights the challenge presented by so much of the infrastructure residing in the private sector. So on one hand, that's why we hear the senator's frustration with the slower response than he would like from the private sector to monitor itself and to try to assist society in countering these efforts in their systems, because so much of the activity that is malicious is taking place within private sector networks, and that obviously presents a lot of complications if we're talking about having some kind of military or Department of Defense type response. The other, I think, challenge that is a little bit of an undercurrent is that creating authorities, legal authorities, to more clearly authorize what we, U.S. government, Department of Defense, can do requires being more transparent about what it is that we're currently doing, what our own military capabilities are, and what activities we're actually doing. There seems to be a perception that, at least with respect to the 2016 events, that U.S. Offensive activities are not very much, that we're not actually doing that much, or we didn't do that much over the last couple of years to counter that activity using any type of military activity. So instead, the response that we've actually seen has been pretty limited. It's been on sanctions issues, and we've seen a lot of use of criminal prosecution, which doesn't have, someone mentioned deterrence early. Criminal prosecution, if you're prosecuting foreign nationals who are never going to come here, and has the effect of laying out for the public a story of what happened in a narrative that we can see, but it doesn't actually, I would argue, doesn't have much of a deterrent effect for these actors. So that's not so much of a response in terms of what can do, but it certainly articulates the challenges. And I think one of the ways to overcome those challenges is U.S. government is going to have to make a decision about whether or not we are willing to reveal a little bit about what it is that we want to do in this space offensively and what our capabilities are, if we want to be able to have agreements with other partners about what they can and cannot do.
And just got one more question in the back before we break. But Richard, I did want to put you on the spot here a little bit. Undergirding that last question, the notion of cyber sovereignty and whatnot, countries like China and Russia. 10 years ago, the goal was a free and open internet around the world. In today's context, from a U.S. strategy and policy perspective, if not that, then what?
Well, I think the dream that we were going to be able to articulate for countries like China, the so-called dictator's dilemma, well, you can either have high economic growth and access to information, or not. It just isn't going to fly because countries like China have shown increasing sophistication in the amounts of information. So if you're a stock trader in Shanghai, you get more information than you would get if you're not, but you may still not get all the information you get if you're in the United States. And so the economic argument doesn't seem, one, to hold up, and two, to be persuasive. Through sort of market share or kind of economic brute force, we also have a hard time kind of, enforcing our vision of a free and open flow of information across a global internet, particularly when the Chinese market is now actually bigger than the United States in terms of users. But I think there's still, if you leave out the countries that have they've made up their mind, the Chinas, the North Koreas, the Russias to some degree, there's still a lot of countries in the middle that are trying to figure out where they're going to go. The medium-sized states, Africa, Central Asia, things like this. And it is ultimately in our interest to see them swing more behind an American-style view of the free flow of online information and internet governance than to go in the direction of China. Whether you're talking about everything from data localization requirements to internet governance practices to censorship to the ability to monitor citizens at home and abroad, all of these kinds of things are bound up into decisions, some of which are still haven't been made by these kind of, swing states, and I think that's where our effort should be.
It brings to mind a report that Richard wrote probably about 5 years ago on global swing states, so it's probably worth revisiting that concept. So I think we have one more in the back, and then we'll wrap.
Good morning, Captain Eric Ramsey, Mar4 Cyber. So we started to get after this question in the last response. So specifically with regard to international law and domestic law, what are we doing? Who holds the ball for pushing that forward and getting something on paper? So the law of armed conflict acknowledges in the introduction that it is insufficient. Now 11 years in the wake of the Bronze Night issue or incident in Estonia, still no kind of international response on how do we respond. So whose responsibility is it and what are we doing?
And so I'm going to turn that over to Carrie here, but I guess I would just add on top would be a little, it should also in reaction to Senator Warner's emphasis. He started, his number one part of his strategy was going to be norms. Is that how you think about this, or are we thinking much more in terms of hard law, international law, domestic law?
Well, it's interesting because, if you're familiar with Tallinn Manual, which describes some of these types of activities, there's still not even a whole lot of consensus on some of these issues among experts who are assembled to address the issues. And so they're complicated issues of international law. I think the approach of trying to work towards international norms is probably going to be the most productive because the legal disagreements are so complicated to resolve. So at least being able to establish international partnerships of like-minded countries that can identify some operating procedure. I think it does tie back to the prior question, which is that in order to do that, we have to acknowledge some of what we're doing and try to adapt what at least the norm should be with what types of activity we think are acceptable and not acceptable amongst democratic states who want to respect free environment and further democracy.
Great. Well, Paul, I don't know if you want to reflect on this a little bit on sort of the issue of technology and norms and law, and then we'll close with Richard.
Yeah, I guess my view is that the instantiation of the policy is your actions, right? And so even if we haven't gotten, there's sort of norms in terms of rules that people have written down, but then there are norms of behavior, right? And we do have norms right now in cyberspace. One of those norms is that you can interfere in American democracy with very little consequences, right? That's a real problem. We've got to work to change that. So, I think first and foremost, there are issues about declaratory policies that Senator Warner talked about. There are good international conversations about writing down norms. I think we need to put our actions first and foremost. People need to pay a consequence, need to be a price for interfering with American democracy, and then we'll see behavior change following that.
Richard?
Yeah, maybe I can sort of put both of those things together for a second. So I think pursuing norms is the right way to go. I don't think you're going to get a cyber treaty out of anybody that you sort of sit down and have a legally binding sort of thing. So norms is the right way to go. But even if you can sort sort of develop and agree on norms with some of the big players, somebody's got to enforce those norms, because someone has to enforce the norms until such time as they are so psychologically, integrated into one's mind that you just follow them by course of habit. It's like standing on the left side of the escalator in the metro, even though no one told you you had to do that, and you can't figure out what the penalty would be if you did something else, right? So who's going to enforce those norms? This gets back to this, you got to impose specific punishments or have specific responses to specific actions that transgress norms, whether we articulate them in some very, multilateral kind of way, or they're just on their face, obviously, in violation of the way we want to conduct our democratic practice. But either way, it gets back to the kind of cost that we're going to impose on those who do this. And if, in a way, if we sort of develop a bunch of norms that do not have the appetite to enforce them, then we're worse off than if we had never tried in the first place.
Great. Well, let me just close by saying, as Toria Newland mentioned at the outset, we here at Center for New American Security are going to be working all dimensions on this problem. Everyone on this stage will be working on different problem sets here. Stay tuned, and thank you all for coming out today.